Up next on Way of the Renaissance Man, learning how to view the world with healthy skepticism.
Welcome to the Way of the Renaissance Man podcast. This is a show about ideas, personal empowerment, and celebrating the rational life. Our goal is to help each other discover the tools needed to better focus our minds, integrate our thoughts with actions, and live the lives we really want. I'm your host, Jim Woods.
Being a Renaissance man isn't just about doing a lot of different things well. It's also about engaging the world with an objective, scientific mindset that is always skeptical of truth claims that don't pass rigorous intellectual muster. Helping the world see things from that perspective is Michael Shermer. Founding publisher of Skeptic magazine, the host of the Science Salon podcast, and a presidential fellow at Chapman University where he teaches Skepticism 101. In addition to being the world's point man in the battle to cultivate healthy scientific skepticism, Michael also spent more than a decade as a professional bicycle racer, which basically vaults him directly into Renaissance man status. In this episode, Michael tells us about how he created his non-traditional career as a writer, publisher, and critical thinking advocate. Jim and Michael also discuss the history of science, the rise of postmodernist thinking, the current assault on truth, the changing nature of politics, and the downside of using labels to categorize people. Jim has been a longtime admirer of Michael Shermer's work, and in this episode, you'll discover why. And now, here's Jim's conversation with Michael Shermer.
So today I'm talking with someone who I've admired for quite a long time. I've been a big fan, and he's probably the most prominent skeptic in the intellectual world today. Michael Shermer, welcome to the Way of the Renaissance Man podcast.
I like to think of myself as a Renaissance man, so yes. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I only have Renaissance men and women on the show.
All right,
so
all right.
I had to pre-qualify
I'm one of many.
Yes.
One of many.
So actually, tell me about that. You have a very unique kind of background. You actually were an athlete, and you are a scholar, and you're a freedom activist. So how did you get started in the whole skeptic movement?
A non-traditional career, as
yes,
they say.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, I just wanted to be a college professor from the beginning, from when I entered college, because it seemed like a great job, where you just get paid to learn and read and write and speak. And but the things just kind of bifurcated and went down different paths, and I just followed them wherever it just seemed the most logical place to go for what I wanted to do. And I'm a medium risk taker, so I was willing to risk stopping my education and being a bike racer for about a decade and pursuing that. So there I learned a lot about business, because we had a bike race company with corporate sponsors and television contracts, and so I learned a lot about that. Then I had a bike shop, Shermer Cycles, so I learned about retail business. And then and that had come about because I worked for a magazine, a bike magazine, which is how I got into cycling in the first place.
Yeah.
So I learned about the publishing business.
Yeah, I remember reading that you kind of got into bicycling because you got that job at the magazine.
Exactly, yeah. So I had no idea, how to sell ads or how to get magazines into bookstores, that kind of stuff. So I learned all that. So by the time we started Skeptic in 1992, I already had a pretty good idea of how to run a business, how to have a budget and raise money, and have bookkeeping and accounting and how to publish a magazine and so forth. So I didn't come out of nowhere. And then my intellectual input on that came from my broad interest in the history of science. I ended up going into the history of science because it allowed me to dabble in a lot of different areas and be a Renaissance man.
Yeah, exactly. Now, did you study psychology?
I did initially, yes. So my first graduate degree was in experimental psychology. The next one was in history of science. History in general, but you have to specialize in something.
Right.
So it was European intellectual history, and then specializing within that, history of science.
That's your PhD work.
Yeah. Right.
So what, and then, so you took that history of science, and it's funny because whenever you study something like the history of science, you see all kinds of different ways in which things didn't go as they were planned to go.
Almost never goes the way things are planned.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Tell me some stories about that.
I was always interested in the evolution creationism controversy, so I studied and wrote a lot about the history of that, and it's never quite so clean. It's not just a simple war of science versus religion, and science won. It's never that simple. So I always thought that was pretty interesting. And so a couple of chapters in my first book, Why People Believe Weird Things, was on the evolution creation controversy. My first published paper in history of science was on the Louisiana creationism case, which gets to this freedom issue. To what extent can the government impose what is being taught? Well, is it private schools or public schools? See, public schools, it's tax money. So I thought, well, I'm kind of a libertarian, so schools should be able to do what they want, but if they're taking money from the government, well, then the people that put that money in, the taxpayers,
must have some say.
And so here the gray area happens. So I'm not against private schools teaching creationism if they want. That's their loss as far as I'm concerned, because it's not good science, but they have the freedom to do that.
Exactly. Well, that's always, I'm of the same mind as you when it comes to the idea about a higher power and all that, but it does seem interesting that the different ways in which certain groups try to kind of morph their message into a science message, because they know that the science message has all the clarity behind it.
That's right. Well, we live in the age of science, so if you want to make your case, you have to argue it in that language, and that's what creationists do. So their initial arguments were equal time. Well, initially the banning of the teaching of evolution. That was culminated in the Scopes trial in 1925. Yes. And even though that case kind of blew up to the ACLU, they were hoping to lose so they could take it to the U.S. Supreme Court on appeal eventually. But the judge overturned the guilty verdict against Scopes because of a technicality of the fine that was levied. It was done incorrectly. So as a consequence, it was thrown out and was never appealed. But the results were teachers didn't want to deal with the controversy from parents, communities, and so on, so they just quit teaching it.
Right.
So it wasn't until Sputnik, and then the concern about we're falling behind the Russians in science and technology, so we got to teach it all. So that then led to not the banning of evolution, but equal time for evolution and creationism. Well, they lost those cases on the First Amendment. You can't teach religion. The government cannot favor one particular religion, which this clearly was.
Yeah, separation clause,
church and state, right? So that led to the third strategy, which was equal time for evolution science and creation science. And that ended in 1988 with the Louisiana's creationism trial. And then in the 90s arose intelligent design theory.
Yes.
So it continues.
There's going to be another iteration of it at some point down the road. Right?
They're like unsinkable rubber ducks. You push them down, they pop back over here.
Well, that's why we need Skeptic Magazine
to help
fight that battle. So tell me about that.
So Skeptic Magazine is a science-based magazine, but we're also activists. We want to teach critical thinking science and find that demarcation line between science and pseudoscience, medicine and alternative medicine, science and religion, and so on. And so we explore all that. So we're a quarterly magazine. We're in every bookstore in North America.
I subscribe, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
I recommend all my listeners do the same.
Thank you. We're also online, of course. Everybody is. And so each issue has a particular theme, and it just depends. We've done quite a bit actually on postmodernism. We're worried about that. I have an issue coming out with Steve Pinker on the cover as the cover story. Are we living in a post-truth world?
Right.
And so this is an interesting way to think about it. Is the claim we're living in a post-truth world true?
Yeah.
If it is, then we're not, because by definition, you're arguing.
Exactly.
And if you're making an argument with evidence and logic, you're not being post-truth.
I always found that kind of postmodern critique. I spoke with Stephen Hicks earlier today.
All right.
And I always found that critique almost self-contradictory, because they're making claims that reason doesn't have any kind of, but it's a rational argument that reason doesn't have any, that it doesn't have any weight, so to speak, or that no humans are, and so therefore we need collectivism and that kind of thing. So that's the dangerous byproduct.
That's right. Intelligent design in in biology is similar to intelligent design in economics. Well, we need a top-down designer to explain this. Well, much of human life can be designed from the bottom up by just people just doing their thing. And we need some structure and regulation, of course, but it's the same kind of argument, like we're turning to some kind of higher power to solve problems, when in fact people are pretty good at solving problems.
Yeah, I think people. That's my critique of the this collectivist mindset, is that people aren't can't do the job. We need some kind of super people. We need the decision makers to impose the order on society. We need them to tell us what we want, how we want it, what we want to do. And I found that somewhat very insulting intellectually.
Right.
So it's a problem because some people want that.
Well, yes, that's right. And of course, cultures differ on that. We're pretty individualistic. But on the conservative liberal spectrum, conservatives, they say they're in favor of small government, but only in certain areas.
Right.
Military, police, legislation, jails. They want big government. Homeland security, terrorism. I'm about to do the gun control debate. But almost 40,000 people a year die by guns. If that was terrorism, conservatives would terminate the Constitution and suspend the Constitution and pour billions of dollars into Homeland Security. But of course, that's different than guns. So anyway, we're not very consistent about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues that seem to be where we love certain animals and we want to protect them, but we eat certain other animals. So
that's right.
And there's a big kind of we like furry, cute things, and we don't like stuff that can hurt us. And it kind of comes down to our kind of upbringing as animals on the plains of Africa, trying to figure out how to survive. Which is I think you made this argument before. That's kind of the genesis of a religious mindset. That kind of idea that, hey, we believe in something that that might not be there, but what's the downside? Yeah,
right,
exactly.
That's right. Yeah. So it doesn't hurt to believe those things as causal agents, unless you think they're witches and they have to be burned, or something like that. I call that the witch theory of causality. Therefore, it's good to know what the real cause is. It's not always harmless just to assume there's some invisible agent in the sky acting on to explain the world. So we have to be careful about that. Also have to be careful about binary black and white thinking, like it's either all of this or all of that. That's kind of false alternative, because most of life is a spectrum. There's degrees, and so it's like we don't want to say, well, we either need huge big government like socialism or no government at all, just total anarchy. That's false choice. We can have some regulation here. What we're arguing about is to what degree of freedom do we want in each area of life, and so on, and that's what politics is really about.
Yeah, I've always, of course, we're here at Freedom Fest 2019, so we're surrounded by kind of libertarian mindsets, libertarian mindsets, obviously, and I am of that mindset as well. But you can definitely see a gradation of things, whereas some libertarians don't think anarchists are the worst. Some libertarians are more traditional conservative libertarians back from the 70s, like a Goldwater kind of conservative.
Yes. Right.
And now there's not really any Goldwater conservatives out there except for the very far libertarian types.
Right.
So the spectrum always changes, even in the political realm. And then, how many presidential candidates that we have now that would be saying what they're saying in any other presidential race up until now?
Right, none. No, it's changed so much.
It's
Now, obviously, Trump's changed what it means to be a conservative or Republican, I guess. Or he's a Trumpian. He's not really any of those other
he doesn't
labels.
fit in any of those
The
molds.
labels, again, another problem with our cognition, labels. We need them. You gotta shortcut how we talk about things. We got to use words, but the labels are really loaded. The moment you say I'm a libertarian or conservative liberal, classical liberal, whatever, people just conjure up, well, here's the things I assume about you, so I don't have to think about you. And it's but I have 5 of those 9. So so we have to talk about each one.
Right. Yeah, but the problem is every person you meet, you can't drill down into that detail. So people have that issue with being able to compartmentalize. We all do it, and like you said, that's part of our tools of cognition that we have to. That's all we're equipped with.
Right. That's right.
So I'm mindful of your time. tell people where they can get Skeptic Magazine, how they can find out about your podcast.
Yep. Okay. So, Skeptic Magazine's in every bookstore in North America, and it's online, of course, at skeptic.com, where you can find everything. Our podcast, eSkeptic, is our electronic magazine. It's free. It's every Wednesday. Every Tuesday we release the podcast and an article from Skeptic Magazine for free. Podcast, The Science Salon. It's a science salon. And each week I interview an author of a nonfiction book, usually a science book or related to that. And so I try to do it before the book is released, and then release the podcast on the day the book comes out, which is always on Tuesdays for some weird reason.
Yes, that's that's the release date.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Science Salon, I highly recommend the podcast.
Thank you.
One of my favorites.
Thank
and
you.
Skeptic Magazine.
Thank you.
Michael, thanks for taking the time.
All right, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right.